course of Roman history. Historians have long debated the concept of turning points, and a universally agreed definition of such events, as of most artificial scholarly constructs, remains frustratingly elusive. That said, it is at least broadly recognized that a historical turning point must be an occurrence that was not only perceived as dramatic at the time it occurred, but that also, when examined in retrospect, demonstrably had an enduring impact on subsequent history. This last point is crucial. Although the Chinese statesman Zhou Enlai's famous and much-quoted response when asked how significant the French Revolution was, that it was too early to tell, is almost certainly apocryphal, he was probably referring instead to the 1968 student riots, the point of the rather dubious anecdote remains valid. An event like, say, the Great Crash of 1929, which must have seemed truly catastrophic at the time, but whose global impact had largely dissipated little more than 10 years later, is not usefully defined as a turning point. And even where an impact is long-term, the relationship between cause and effect is often ambiguous and controversial. As one example among numerous, the fall of Byzantium in 1453 is generally recognized as a major historical turning point. But clearly, by the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire was so weakened by internal conflict, and the Ottomans were by contrast so nearly invincible, that the conquest was all but inevitable, whether it happened in 1453 or 10 years earlier or 10 years later. But 1453 can still legitimately be considered the turning point simply because it was in fact then that events began their new course. The same reasoning can be applied to other major turning points of history, whether the Battle of Gettysburg, or Caesar crossing the Rubicon, or the signing of the Magna Carta, or Luther nailing his 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. And the same reasoning can also be applied to the fire of AD 64. The impact of the Great Fire proved to be fatally destructive, not only for the hapless Romans caught up by the flames, but ultimately also for Nero himself. Until then, he had enjoyed a golden reputation, so much in charge of things both at home and abroad, and apparently so successful at them, that people were prepared to overlook his occasional transgressions. But the rumours about his conduct during the fire, the ineffectiveness of the fire services operating under his authority to bring it to a speedy end, as well as a seemingly callous scheme to build a massive palace complex on land now cleared of its fine old properties, led to a massive collapse of faith and caused an irreparable breach between the emperor and Rome's powerful elite. Nero, reputedly, tried to shift the blame onto the Christians, already an unpopular group, and subjected them to savage punishments. If this did in fact happen, it failed to help. His extended honeymoon period was well and truly over. From AD 64 on, his reign was marred by suspicion and conspiracies, leading eventually to overt rebellion and to the death in decidedly squalid circumstances of the emperor himself. And because Nero's personal demise also represented the demise of the ruling dynasty to which he had belonged, the Julio-Claudians, the fire marked the first stage in a process that would transform how the rulers of Rome were chosen. Henceforth, they would no longer come from the line of the first Emperor Augustus, that golden thread of consensus and stability. In AD 68, within 4 years of the fire, the leadership of the Roman Empire was opened up to competitive bidding, and this phenomenon persisted intermittently as a seriously destabilizing factor for as long as that empire existed. Of course, it is undoubtedly the case that had Nero not alienated his powerful colleagues because of the fire, he inevitably would have found some other means of alienating them, and that because of his self-evident shortcomings he was almost guaranteed to come eventually to an unhappy end. And it is equally true that if the Julio-Claudian dynasty had not ended with Nero, it would have